Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 36th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Zoe. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, not all unadulterated praise, and some answers from us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. It's September 5th. On this day in 1793, the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution began. It lasted 10 months until the coup of 27 July 1794, leading to the so-called Thermidorian reaction. The terror was a period of violence that occurred after the onset of the revolution, incited by conflict between rival political factions, the Girondins and the Jacobins, and marked by mass executions of enemies of the revolution. The death toll ranged in the tens of thousands, with 17,000 executed by guillotine and another 25,000 in summary executions across France. I remember, actually...
Oh, don't tell us you were there, Carl.
No, I wasn't there, but I was taken by someone who almost was, at least literarily. I was thinking of reading as a young man Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee of King Arthur's Court. And I had picked up the book with an interest in things romantic and medieval and so forth, and found a very strange piece of work, in some ways one of the most peculiar novels of the American 19th century. And in it, Twain, who was very interested in politics, history, and what we would now call human rights. At the end of the century, he was a moving force in the Anti-Imperialist League, which worked against American colonialism abroad in the late 19th century. But in the midst of Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, which he'd written 10 years earlier. The story is about a New Englander who, for some peculiar mechanism, time travels back to the court of King Arthur and uses his modern skills, such as they are, to, in fact, bring the entire court down. He ends up electrocuting the entire chivalry of Arthurian England at the end of the novel. It's a very dark novel in a lot of ways, and it was dark in part because of Twain's view of politics. Twain's view of politics are actually interestingly complex. George Orwell wrote a very good piece called The Licensed Jester about the tergiversations of Twain on political matters. And it's shown up in part, or at least his starting point, is shown up in a Connecticut Yankees and King Arthur's Court, where he talks about the Reign of Terror. In the novel, he says, there were two reigns of terror, if we would but remember it and consider it. The one wrought murder and hot passion, the other in heartless cold blood. The one lasted mere months, the other had lasted 1,000 years. The one inflicted death upon 10,000 persons, the other upon 100 millions. but our shutters are all for the horrors of the minor terror, the momentary terror, so to speak. Whereas what is the horror of swift death by the axe compared with lifelong death from hunger, cold, insult, cruelty, and heartbreak? What is swift death by lightning compared with death by slow fire at the stake? A city cemetery could contain the coffins filled by that brief terror, which we have all been so diligently taught to shiver at and mourn over. But all France could hardly contain the coffins filled by that older and real terror, that unspeakably bitter and awful terror which none of us has been taught to see in its vastness or pity as it deserves. Close quote. Mark Twain from A Yankee in King Arthur's Court, contrasting the brief terror with the long one. Now, one might say he's not entirely fair to the Middle Ages here, but the general point certainly is worth thinking about, and we've been urged to think about it again recently with the murders of American journalists by the Islamic State in the Middle East, viewed with horror by the United States, which is just over a period of killing literally hundreds of thousands of people in the same region, but not so picturesquely, we might say. And that seems to be the point that Twain is making. And I thought of a modern parallel that's worth thinking about. There was a few years ago a famous book published in France, translated quickly into English and so forth, called The Black Book of Communism, that tried to give an account of how many people had died from the machinations of the communist revolution in Russia, and communist revolutions in Russia and China. And after much thrashing about in the history of the 20th century, the book came to the conclusion that since 1917, perhaps 100 million people had died because of communism. Now, there's all sorts of ways we might argue about that, but the most important point about it seemed to me to be one much like Twain's. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen compared post-independence India with communist China, covering the years 1949 to 1979. These are years including the Great Leap Forward in China and the famines that were attendant upon the reconstruction of society after the triumph of the Communist Revolution in China in '49. Sen concluded that capitalist social policy in India in these 30 years had killed more than 100 million people, a total exceeding the deaths caused by all communist states after 1917, according to the Black Book, including the mass famine in China in the late 1950s. So once again, it seemed to me that a modern analog to Twain's point in A Connecticut Yankee, a point having to do with scale and with the unrecognized injuries of class over against the outrages of revolutionaries. I quoted here a week or two ago James Connolly's comment from the First World War that one great source of the strength of the ruling class is willingness to kill in defense of its power and privileges, be it once challenged by domestic revolutionaries or foreign foes, the ruling class is willing to kill and kill and kill. That contrasts sharply with the hesitancy of all real revolutionists to indulge in killing. Well, you can argue about that, as I say, and none of that is meant to suggest the killing done by even real revolutionists, as Connolly would say, or the killings done by the Islamic State, and that have been, which have so horrified the President of the United States. But it seems to me that in this week, which comes up to the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, it's worthwhile to think about terror and terrorism in a way that will lead us to perhaps some more reasonable political accounts. Terrorism, as it is used in American parlance, means primarily the colonized world striking back in arms. Even the 9/11 attacks were, of course, counterattacks to the activities that the U.S. had carried on in the Middle East. The perpetrators of 9/11 said they did it because of the oppression of the Palestinians, the sanctions against Iraq, which had killed by American admission 500,000 children, and the investment of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic holy places with American troops. Well, once again, not a justification, but an understanding of the political context in which it happens. I'd like to take a moment to read a comment by our mentor, Noam Chomsky, on the use of the term terrorism. He writes, "I've been writing about international terrorism ever since Reagan declared a war on terror in 1981. It's been a staple of American politics for much longer than the period since 9/11. In doing so, I have kept the official definitions of terrorism in U.S. and British law and in Army manuals, all approximately the same. To take one succinct official definition, terrorism is, quote, the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature, through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear," close quote. Everything I've just described, and a great deal more like it, falls within the category of terrorism. In fact, state-directed international terrorism in the technical sense of U.S. and British law. For exactly that reason, the official definitions are unusable. They fail to make a crucial distinction. The concept of terrorism must somehow be crafted to include their terrorism against us, while excluding our terrorism against them, often far more extreme. To devise such a definition is a challenging task. Accordingly, from the 1980s, there have been many scholarly conferences, academic publications, and international symposia devoted to the task of defining terrorism. The Academy has been busy at its task. In public discourse, the problem does not arise, however. Well-educated circles have internalized the special sense of terrorism required for justification of state action and control of domestic populations, as in Ferguson, Missouri, and departure from the canon, as generally ignored or if noticed, elicits impressive tantrums. So, you are watching News from Neptune, a Reign of Terror edition, and the first shower will come from Ronzo.
Yes. Is there a black book of anti-communism?
Well, there's been. I don't know. I know that it was proposed.
Yeah, because there are millions who have been killed in the name of
Sure.
opposing communism.
Exactly.
In
Well, even
Indonesia, in Vietnam, and on and on.
And even a better controlled experiment in relation to the former Soviet Union and Russia is the skyrocketing decrease in lifespans in post 1989 in Russia. There's all kinds of ways to attribute death. It doesn't have to be by murder per se, but when the bottom drops out of how long people live, especially in that case men, you're talking about shortened lives. You're talking about unnecessary deaths, and that was due to capitalism, or what Noam Chomsky calls really existing capitalism, as it has existed since then. And of course now Putin is being demonized for sort of modifying the ravages of global capitalism as it entered the Soviet Union under Yeltsin in the 1990s.
Yeah, there are many directions we could go from that, but one of the things that's been noted is the collapse of the system of public health in Russia at the time,
Yes.
which has dramatically decreased, apparently, lifespans in Russia. And, well, there's a longer story there. I want to return to my usual theme I keep harping on, the increasing divergence, the gap between the rich and the poor. Headline from the Wall Street Journal, Fed, gap between rich and poor Americans widened during the recovery. We keep hearing that what we need is recovery and economic growth, but whenever it happens, it seems that the benefits of it largely accrue to one class and not another, and go overwhelmingly to the very richest people already. So the problem, it seems to me, is not economic growth, but just distribution of the increasing national wealth. But that turns out to be a hot topic, and you'll get accused of advocating class warfare, and as if there's not enough class warfare going on already. But anyway, another headline from the local paper, 1 in 5 here relying on food assistance. Study indicates that the middle class is shrinking rapidly. Urbana, 1 out of 5 people in the 14-county area in east central Illinois are relying on food pantries and meal service programs to eat, according to a new report released Monday by the Eastern Illinois Food Bank and Feeding America. The report found an upswing in the number of people in this area relying on food pantry and meal service assistance from 4 years ago, from about 105,000 people to 116,800 people. So I won't read all of this to you. That can become deadly. But
it's important to note that it's an aspect of corporate welfare.
yes,
The
yes.
fact that either food stamps or charity has to feed people who are working at Walmart
Right.
and so forth, is an aspect of corporate welfare to go on top of all the corporate welfare they get for all kinds of reasons, including developing the land to build Walmarts and Lowe's and Menards and all these other places.
But doesn't it make you really burn with indignation that some of those people on food stamps are buying seafood? I mean,
I hadn't heard that one before, but I guess you're listening to Rush Limbaugh more than
Yeah, right,
more
right.
than I have.
yeah, well, it's ridiculous. But the rising tide of prosperity or economic growth, once again, does not affect everyone equally. It lifts the yachts, let's say, but leaves the dinghies and kayaks and rowboats and the poor people who are paddling desperately to stay afloat far behind. And the distance between them becomes ever greater. I want to suggest for your commentaries an editorial in the New York Times on, or the day before Labor Day, and ask you what it suggests about the strengths and limitations of liberal, that is corporate liberal ideology as it's understood today. Labor today, wages and salaries still lag as corporate profits surge. In the months before Labor Day last year, job growth was so slow that economists said it would take until 2021 to replace the jobs that were lost or never created in the recession and its aftermath, alluding, I guess, to the recession of 2008 and 9. The pace has picked up since then. At the current rate, missing jobs will be recovered by 2018. Still 5 years into an economic recovery that has been notable for resurging corporate profits, the number and quality of jobs are still lagging badly, as are wages and salaries. In 2013, after-tax corporate profits as a share of the economy tied with their highest level on record in 1965, while labor compensation as a share of the economy hit its lowest point since 1948. Wage growth since 1979 has not kept pace with productivity growth, a point sometimes made by David, resulting in falling or flat wages for most workers and big gains for corporate coffers, shareholders, executives, and others at the top of the income ladder. So the theme again is the ever-widening gap, and what that's doing to us as a society and as a nation, as a culture. And more economists, I think, are beginning to take note that this is becoming itself a constraint on economic growth. And unless that supposed growth and economic gain is shared more equally, what seems further down the road And inherent in capitalism is a ever worsening economic crisis. And maybe we can come back to that later.
I think Paul Street, who's visited our town a couple of times, has a nice article on the ZNet website today, sort of basically a critique of Thomas Piketty's book Capital, which we've talked about many times on this show, talking about what Piketty doesn't talk about in terms of labor, that he doesn't really mention labor in that book, and Street's very sort of negative take on the popularity of Piketty's book, as much as it has enlightened many people about the nature of the economic inequality about which you speak, is that he feels it's something that is saying that there's great economic equality, but not much can be done about it, including, revitalizing the labor movement. And so Street even quotes a fairly just a liberal Keynesian economist, Dean Baker, in terms of Baker's negativity about, or Baker's criticism of Piketty's lack of practical analysis and practical proposals of what can actually be done pretty easily in terms of at least modestly decreasing inequality in this country, including lowering the value of the dollar, which is artificially high, and revitalizing labor unions, and putting more money in and raising minimum wage.
Yeah. What about Piketty's solution of a global wealth tax?
Well, I think that's the kind of thing that he can. It's a global wealth tax or a national wealth tax it's an important proposal, and it's pretty much more. It's getting down to a more fundamental level than fiddling with income taxes and even corporate taxes. So that's important that Piketty's saying that. But when affluent people read that book, or even people say what's politically possible, I think what Baker's pointing out and what Street's pointing out is there's much more activism possible. They're not talking necessarily about just an accommodating or ameliorative approach to gradually decreasing inequality, but they are talking about some things that can be done if several things were to be done, could make people's lives a lot better. And Piketty isn't really proposing those practical measures.
Yeah. I think one of the virtues of Piketty's book, and one of the things that in fact scares the 1%, is as Ron suggests, the structural nature of the reforms he proposes. There are plenty of people who have suggested that ways in which adjusting the tax system, increasing labor militancy and so forth will have beneficial effects for the society. But part of Piketty's work is to show that these are drops in the bucket. That these are good, these are worthwhile, and so forth, but they're not going to change that long-term reign of terror, which indeed is sort of what he is analyzing in his book, the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people, as a trend that only can be reversed by quite sweeping transformations. Notably, the taxation of wealth and the taxation of speculation.
Yeah, there's just a little, it's complicated and interesting, but I mean, Piketty is being criticized for being too basically. On the one hand, he's proposing a structural understanding of what's going on, but he hasn't gotten it to the level where you can really see what the person that Paul Street refers to most in his critique of Piketty is David Harvey, and how David Harvey views capital in a Marxist framework. And without that understanding, what Street is pointing out, what Harvey is pointing out, that Piketty can he can say that a wealth tax is really something that needs to be done, but he can't understand he can't get us to understanding what the social and political relations are that might bring that about. So I think what Street, for better or worse, is accusing Piketty of is promoting complacency among the relatively more privileged people who might be reading his book. We might agree or not agree with that. Perhaps we can return to that at some time. But.
The immediate problem for many people is, should we oppose ameliorative or reformist steps in the meantime, because they will not bring about ultimate nirvana.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for the most part that's a false dilemma. I mean, I agree with you that there may be even a temperamental difference between people who want to make the sorts of changes that will really make a difference, and those who say, well, let's just see if we can make things a little better.
Yes.
You know, and that almost be a matter of personal style more than anything. But there's no reason that they're necessarily at odds. Yes. And to reject a reform on the grounds that it's not sweeping enough doesn't sound like a good idea.
Well, it goes on.
There's another problem, but there's another problem, and that's when the reform is used. A reform is proposed precisely to avoid the sweeping changes that are necessary. And
can you say 10-10?
Well, the capitalist class is pretty good at that, and has been for a long time. It's the sop, small treat thrown to the protesters that makes them go away.
Yeah.
You know, is what could be more common? Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is the well-known theory of the amelioratives that. When the social conflict becomes too great, then it becomes time to apply this, and it's a dilemma.
But you know, we see in recent days just the fast food workers fight for 15, and they're not buying. I mean, Obama thought that people could be silenced by federal workers or federal, employees on federal contracts or whatever getting 10-10. Gradually, there wasn't even 10-10 right away, versus the fight for 15, which I think is much more meaningful, and that it provides this contrast between, the minimum wage is still just the minimum wage, and it's not even a living wage, but still that contrast between what Obama proposed with his 10-10, in which Democrats and liberals are supposed to buy into as some kind of progress.
Yeah.
We've had the same argument. It worked out practically on things like Obamacare, on what happened in Wisconsin when there was a serious demand for change by a governor who was able to divide the opposition on just these lines and maintain his position. So this is there's nothing new here. It seems to me that the attempt to decide what's we're like poor Mr. Obama, we don't have a strategy. Well, that's not quite true. We do have a strategy. What we don't have often are tactics. What to do today, what to do tomorrow, this week.
Back to the New York Times Labor Day editorial. Unionization is associated with higher wages and benefits, especially for low-wage workers, which argues for greater legal enforcement of the right to organize without retaliation. Stronger enforcement of both labor laws and antitrust laws is needed to ensure against wage theft. What is wage theft? It's refusal to obey the law or failure to obey the law concerning overtime, minimum wage, and so on. And there's an enormous amount of that going on, especially among the very lowest paid workers, perhaps illegal immigrants, who at the end of the week or 2 weeks, their employer says, sorry, we're not going to pay you, buzz off.
Yeah.
And what can they do? They can't go to the police.
So sue me, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. The pay of middle income workers has also been diminished. Decades of outsourcing government jobs to the private sector has undercut public employment, once a mainstay of middle-class life, even as evidence has mounted that outsourcing often does not save money or improve services. What's needed is a systematic review of government contracts with the private sector and a willingness to end those that are counterproductive. Well, yeah, blah, blah. Another threat to middle-class wages is rampant misclassification. of employees as independent contractors and of workers as supervisors, a tactic that employers use to deny pay and benefits that would otherwise be due. So this says there has been progress since last Labor Day. Mr. Obama has signed executive orders to improve the pay and working conditions of employees of federal contractors. The Labor Department is revising rules on overtime pay. Simply updating them for inflation would make millions of additional workers eligible for time and a half for overtime. What is still lacking, however, is a full employment agenda that regards labor, not corporations, as the center of the economy, a change that would be a reversal of the priorities of the last 35 years. And that sounds okay to me as far as it goes, but of course we'll be told that it doesn't go far enough. I certainly agree with that.
Even just looking at unemployment, which isn't we can talk about wage disparity and GDP as being too gross, but even the way unemployment statistics are being used, whenever they come out and they're slightly better in terms of the way they look, the local politicians, and I mean Democratic politicians, Pat Quinn and Mayor Don Gerard of Champaign, are rushing to take credit for what looks like decreased unemployment rates. Right. And again, what Dean Baker is pointing out on his blog in the last couple of days is that the way to look at employment is to look at the ratio of the employed to the population. Not that that tells you about wages per se, but at least tells you about who's working. But more than that, you look at the ratio of the prime working age people, 25 to 54 is the way they do it, the way they calculate that. And employment hasn't gotten any better. It's still a full 3 percentage points at least down from where it was prior to 2008. So in terms of a county like this or a city like Champaign, we're talking about thousands of people being out of work who were working. Right. who are no longer working. So I'm just appalled by the way that these figures come out, and people like Quinn and Gerard. I haven't heard Laura Pressing. Well, she isn't running, so Gerard's running. So how he even takes credit for what the unemployment rate is or isn't, I have no idea.
Who was the civil rights leader who long ago said all this talk about unemployment and what the government is doing on unemployment shouldn't get us too excited? He said, after all, we had full employment under slavery.
I don't know who that civil rights leader.
I don't know who that was. I got to
Sounds like it might have been Stokely Carmichael.
Well, it could well have been Stokely.
Yeah.
Well, the dialectic here is that if unemployment goes up, is there any tendency in some quarters to blame the president or the governor or some other public official for that?
It's really, unemployment figures are part of the whole silliness about the way the media and politicians, with the help of politicians, covers the economy as a whole. We have too high unemployment because that's the policy. Okay, right. The policy is to keep people out of work so they won't demand higher wages because it's a very loose labor market.
Shouldn't we blame these public officials because it happened on their watch?
Indeed,
it's been happening on their watch since the 1970s.
Well, we have an interesting divergence.
It's been happening on their watch ever since Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker to run the Federal Reserve.
I think David is being too optimistic even to say
probably.
But still at all.
Okay, so let's go back to Gerald Ford.
We can't we can't throw the rascals out because we never threw them in, remember?
Yeah, right.
I mean, they've been doing this all along.
Yeah.
But the point is that there are reforms that would indeed redound to people's bene esse, and they include such things as real jobs program. I mean, they finally had to come to that during the Depression. And they created the Works Progress Administration, even though employers were shocked and did everything they could to try to prevent it. Things had got bad enough that a system that would give people jobs who needed them was finally instituted in the second Depression, so to speak, during the Roosevelt administration. We have no politicians today, no one, saying anything like that. There's nothing like a proposal for a Works Progress Administration. There's nothing like the sort of proposals that we got, say, from the Nixon administration for a guaranteed annual income, which would involve jobs creation programs. That's just off the board. That's a generational change. That's may not be all Paul Volcker's fault, but it certainly is a result of the neoliberal counterattack of the last 40 years that the remedies that are proposed today are so much further to the right than the remedies that were taken for granted 2 generations ago.
The legal charge of the Federal Reserve is to keep inflation low and unemployment low. But in the last 35 to 40 years, its charge has been basically to keep inflation low and unemployment much too high.
And there's no indication that a more aggressive policy by the Federal Reserve would, in fact, produce any sort of inflation, as Paul Krugman keeps insisting.
Yes.
Isn't there a notion that there is a optimum level of unemployment?
There is that notion. It's called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, NAIRU, and it became very popular in the 1990s under Clinton when unemployment kept going down. And even Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve at that time, it was thought to be, through some hocus pocus, 6%, that when unemployment got lower than 6%, inflation would become unacceptably high. Even Alan Greenspan was forced to admit, as unemployment got lower, that the NAIRU got lower. It really wasn't some sort of scientific law. It's something very much having to do with the particular circumstances of that time. But even when inflation does go up, it's in an economy in which wages are keeping up with inflation, no less productivity. Inflation doesn't hurt average normal people. It's wealthy people that are hurt by that because of the nature of the valuation of their assets. So it's the idea of keeping inflation low is just a part of class warfare. That's all it is.
Yeah.
As is a natural rate of unemployment, beyond which the workers get uppity.
Right,
and,
exactly.
So that's what really is
because
involved
you can go
there.
to a better job if there's a shortage of workers. You can go to a better job, and concerns have to compete with workers by offering them better wages.
What about this piece I thought was interesting, the Wall Street Journal, July 14th, lower job churn hurts young workers. Not enough people are quitting their jobs, apparently. Quitting a job often can be a good thing, but not enough workers have been doing it. During and after the recession, the U.S. economy has been too weak for many workers to undertake the sort of job hopping that economists say is critical to building careers and advancing the nation's long-term growth prospects. The consequence, even many Americans who have remained employed have stunted their earnings growth by staying pinned down to their current jobs. The weak job churn is among Federal Reserve Chairwoman Janet Yellen's leading concerns about an economy that is improving steadily, but with substantial scars just below the surface.
You know, Doug
weak job churn, isn't that something? I mean, that's
Doug Henwood did an interview recently on one of his programs with a fellow who researched, I forget the name, a fairly well-known journalist who researched the whole monopolistic employment practices in Silicon Valley of Google and Apple and the other Facebook, other concerns there, who have agreed, have a sort of gentleman's agreement not to hire away each other's workers at higher wages.
That's right. Yeah, hey, look,
so maybe that's part of why jobs aren't churning as much as they should be.
If you escape from one plantation, you're not really going to get much help at the next plantation to go to work, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
But if they really competed with each other for these, supposedly the classical market-based ideas that, high tech, I mean, we're looking for innovative people, we're looking for smart people. To get them, we will have to pay them more. No, you stay at Google, you stay at Facebook, you stay at Apple, and we'll figure it out, and we'll pay you less. And the profits in those concerns obviously are exorbitant. Very little of what they make goes to their people who do most of the grunt work. I'm not saying they have bad jobs. I'm not saying they're not making a living in Silicon Valley. That's probably not the best example of people not churning, but
Yeah, well, what about this practice I hear? At the time these people are hired, especially at the higher levels, they are required to sign a no-compete
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
contract.
oh yeah, and they can't leave. They can't leave,
Right.
and they have to take some time off to leave. I mean, there's some aspects of that that have to do with government versus private employment, which are good and which are probably superficial anyway and abused by lobbyists and so forth. But
Yeah, well, it's a condition of employment apparently. One of these places that if they do leave the company, they can't work for any other conceivably competing company for 2 to 3 years afterwards.
Welcome to the free market.
Yeah,
Yes,
right.
exactly. Right.
Yeah, so they're kind of locked in many cases.
Yeah.
Funny about that.
Yeah.
You're watching News from Neptune. Let's, in the time we have left, maybe turn to a local story or two. Anything happening at the little university around the corner, David?
What's happening in our community? You wouldn't know it from listening to our program, but we are the epicenter of radical change. Not only in
shows you
not
how much
only
trouble
on
we're really in.
campus, not only in the whole world. And I'm exaggerating that, but they're really Andrew Levine, a writer who writes regularly in Counterpunch this morning, suggests that what's going on with the Salida case and the pushback from that might be indication of really big things to happen. So you can be following
Hope
these.
springs eternal.
Yeah, it does. There's a lot of Corey Robin, the well-known left political scientist, has been covering this on his blog quite thoroughly. If that's one place you want to look, it's of course being covered in the local newspaper, on Electronic Intifada, on Mondoweiss. And the issue I want to bring up certainly is not unrelated to what we've been talking about so far. It seems to me, what is this about? Why has the ruling class put so much of their capital, so to speak, or their credit, so to speak, into ensuring that Stephen Salida can't teach students in an area mostly unrelated to Israel-Palestine at the U of I? Why have they gone this far and are shooting themselves in the foot? If Phyllis Wise had been true to her last name, she would have, when she found out that there was this Israel lobby Twitter and email campaign to dislodge this fellow from his prospective job, she would have just calmed down the Board of Trustees and said, we don't have a hotbed of pro-Palestinian politics on this campus. This guy isn't going to make any difference. Yeah. We don't have any Palestinians. Right. We've never had any, with all the talk of diversity, we don't have any scholar of Palestinian background who addresses in any even peripheral way this issue in the context of his or her work. She would have just said, you're asking for it here, but I think that the ruling class is scared. I think that the Israel lobby is scared. I think that they felt that they had to make a point here after Gaza, after this recent massacre. Yeah. They realized that they're not, pardon this expression, but they're not controlling the narrative anymore, and they are concerned about that. And the U of I is easy pickings. We're not a hotbed of political activism. They thought they could get away with this and send a message. Carl, you're on the pessimist side. Corey Robin is more on the positive side. I think I'm in the middle. Okay. But I mean, I don't know what to say, because as Yogi Berra said, the future is hard. It's hard to predict. It's hard to predict, especially the future. But
as Yogi Berra's friend Antonio Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Yeah, right.
You've got to be accurate about what. And I mean, I'm afraid they are going to get away with it. I really do. Yeah. That's no reason to deny the optimism of the will.
Right.
When you come to a fork in the road, take it.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm most fascinated. I mean, I've been following this very closely and in a way that's a little gossipy and obsessive. But I'm just fascinated by the local politics behind this. I'm fascinated by the full-page ad that was taken out of the paper on Sunday. Somebody on Twitter has actually gone to this. I sent around a link on the aware list this morning and identified all these people. It's obvious this is the ruling. This is the local bourgeoisie who are threatened by the idea that Phyllis Wise might be challenged. These aren't necessarily avid Zionists, a few of them are. They just don't like the idea that people are getting uppity here.
Exactly.
And so they're running to Phyllis Wise's rescue, meaning they're scared too, So there's a whole lot going on here beyond the Israel-Palestine, but the Israel-Palestine thing really seems to be a focal point of where things are kind of breaking down in the dominant narrative, the master narrative.
That is precisely right, David. I think that's exactly what's going on. And I think in order to understand how that's happened and why the guardians of order are worried, you really have to have hung around in American universities for about a generation and saw what happened there. Remember, there was a great intellectual purge of American universities in the 1950s, parallel to the general rectification of names that was taking place in American politics. We ascribe it to one dipso senator from Wisconsin and speak of McCarthyism, but in fact it was a general problem, a problem that's occurred in a similar way after the First World War, of making sure that the ideological challenges that grew out of the war do not discommode the ruling class in any significant way. Well, that task was done by 1960. It was finished. And nothing surprised the American ruling class more than the explosion 5 years later of outrage in the American university system, of all places, at what the federal government was doing abroad. Who would have ever thought that students and, worse yet, faculty would get upset about that? You had to live through that to know how frightened American universities were by the outbreaks of the 60s, and you have to live through the subsequent decade to know how much effort was exerted to make sure that it wouldn't happen again. It was part of the neoliberal blowback beginning in the 70s, and indeed it worked. It is instructive to reflect that the wars in Southwest Asia did not produce the sort of in the last 10 years, did not produce the sort of outcry in American universities that the wars in Southeast Asia had in the 60s. Why the difference? Well, one of the reasons for the difference was the careful program of keeping the lid on, of vetting the political opinions of faculty members, of making sure that no untoward political opinions got any purchase whatsoever within the American university system. It was a self-sealing system. It worked very well, and the breakdown of that system is what we see in the Salita business. The control is not there. The control did not work as it would have worked had this been 10 years ago. And I think you're exactly right. That's why those who conceive themselves as in control of wealth and power in this country are upset about this matter, and why they have to make sure that the lid goes back on. I do think they will, but there's some aspect of this that will not go away, and that's what we should be building on.
You see some signs of panic in those higher circles.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
I hesitate to speculate about other people's mental acts.
Just look at what they've done.
Yeah. The rhetoric has just been so. I mean, this has brought forth some of the worst rhetoric and worst apologism that that I've seen recently. It's not about Israel Palestine. It's about respect and civility and dignity and all that. And it's about the chancellor has to wear many hats, including a fair hat, whatever a fair. Ron, you're the hat man around here.
Yeah, right.
You can tell us what a fair hat is. But I just, it's just there. I mean, just reading reading the comments on the News Gazette website on Corey, one of the interlopers on Corey Robin, the rationalizations. We're talking here about a guy with a perfectly decent record, perfectly qualified hire for this job,
right?
And then they're talking about his tweets as if that's not protected speech. We shouldn't have to be talking about even the substance of his tweets, but it's clear that he was just angry. He was passionate. He's not an anti-Semite. He's not a hater. And the ludicrous notion that a Jewish student, some hypothetical Jewish student on campus, is going to be threatened sitting in his classroom, it's too ludicrous to even comment about. But this is what all these 135 members of the Champaign Country Club have to do in putting their ad. And that's been documented. I mean, they're not all, but that's been documented on this Twitter thing that you can get through the Aware Peace List or through Corey Robbins' website, that it's just these 135 people. They just it's like they come out of the woodwork and say, you know, we're the people who run this community.
That's right.
You know, we're not. Who do you think you are? We're Fox. We're Jimmy John. We're important people. We're very important people, very serious people, and we want nothing but civility and respect and diversity. And it's a big joke. I almost sweared for a second there on News from Neptune.
Oh, you can't have that.
No.
Decorum, civility.
I almost said what kind of a joke.
You have to be a nice guy.
Yeah, right.
Remain responsible.
Yeah, right. As Saletti has gotten into my blood, and I haven't even met this man yet.
Yeah. Well, obviously, it brought out the local establishment. All these real estate people. That was amazing.
Yes, the real estate people.
Yeah.
The Wamplers and
Yeah.
the Ramshaws.
Yeah.
I mean, this is who these people are, and it really reveals who runs what's going on around here. The relationship between them and the board of trustees, and then sort of the statewide aspect of that with Chris Kennedy and the Merchandise Mart.
Yeah.
And you see all these interlocking 1%.
Yeah.
And the local ones are fairly small time in the larger state and national pictures, but they want to think of themselves as being big shots in this relatively, in this Big Ten college town, this boosterish town. They'd love to have a better football team. They're not going to get it this year, but still,
That's what
it's
this
just,
is really about.
Yeah, it was. They're all. That's one thing that was documented on this list was how many of them are donors to the Illinois Loyalty Circle. So this is where this is really a teachable moment for understanding class politics and class warfare, and how that's been transformed. How the words like diversity and respect have been incorporated into that discourse. Because you can't just hate people anymore. I mean, Jim Dye can ridicule people and all that, and people on the comments section, but these people with their full page ad have to be a little nicer about it. They have to put their complaints in relatively liberal terms. Whether that's progress or not, I don't know. Well, no, it's not.
You acquired knowledge at the last second there. But.
Right. So, let's see. We'll reflect on the next episode of News from Neptune, aka Grumpy Old Man. So,
The panel of curmudgeons, right?
yeah.
I might mention again what has happened in academia. I said this last week also. I think that I'm impressed, again, having been around universities most of my adult life, at the ability to, of a suggestion that you will grant or withhold a large sum of money to change more academic minds in 10 minutes. They can be changed in 10 years. Mere
You're such a cynic, Ron. Good heavens.
It was even pointed out this week that the amount of money these donors give into endowed funds really isn't all that much to even pay the chairs, the professors who get these salaries. Even if you donate $1 million, if you're only getting 1 or 2% a year interest on that, we're talking about 10 or 20. If my math is right, yeah, it is. $10,000 or $20,000. That doesn't pay a Swanland professor or a whatever professor of history. So they're intimidated. The idea of trustees being intimidated by donors, or Phyllis Wise being intimidated by donors, is kind of calculated in a certain way. It's kind of phony in a certain way. It's a matter of playing into what their class interests are. They're a part of this group of people. They have to say this is their excuse for advocating for the 1% and repressing alternative voices. I just wanted to say that one of us wrote a letter, or actually a guest commentary. One of us wrote a guest commentary, and all three of us signed it. That's going to, I think, appear in the paper this Sunday, from what I can tell, and signed by a few other of our friends. And I think it states, I hope it states in pretty clear terms, some of the things we've been trying to say here about this historical process.
What, you don't believe in the William Buckley thesis at Yale that the big donors have a right to dictate what shall be taught and who will teach it?
Wasn't the big donor God?
Right, well, God and man at Yale, yeah. But especially important in the economics and
I think you're
social science departments.
You're overlooking leverage here, you guys. I mean, the big donors, put in their money on the grounds that there will be, exactly, forthcoming from the government and whatnot. And it's a complex financial arrangement because, of course, the primary reason for making college expensive right now is to keep students quiet. And that seems to me to be absolutely obvious. And when I suggested that to the president of this university, he said, no one's ever said that to me. Meaning the people who are making the decisions.
But
said, no one's ever opposed it.
It's heartening to see that there are a group of students who's going to the trouble of really opposing this, putting themselves on the line.
Yes,
I think they're a little too vulnerable to hearing
indeed.
some of Phyllis Wise's sweet talk. Well, vulnerable in the general sense, but also to meeting with Philip Wise. And I think she is saying this person, this to this person, and that to that person. She's saying 5 different things to 5 different people and waiting until this blows over.
Yeah. But they are taking their names.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that's true. There are so many things that we have not talked about today that should be talked about. We haven't even mentioned the fact that our chief magistrate is in Wales, of all places, trying to figure out how the Russian economy can be seriously injured and the European economy can be reduced to American control even more than it already is. This is important. This involves killing people, of course, which they're doing busily in Eastern Europe as well as the Middle East, and it is we should not ignore it for the fact that there are local implications, indeed, of what we're talking about there going on at the little local university.
Yeah, well, there are more and more little things getting through, I think, about the effect of this, the Russian sanctions, what it's doing to Western Europe, which is worse than what it's doing to Russia, and that this may have some limiting effect on that.
And we will unfortunately have to postpone that discussion till next week. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 36th week of 2014, the Reign of Terror edition. Have a happy September 11th. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Zook. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake and Jason. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview on Sunday with Neptuner David Johnson, Progressive Voices Monday 3 to 5, and on WRFU Radio, Living Simply on the first Friday of the month at 8 a.m. with Ron Zook. There is a demonstration tomorrow from 2 to 4 p.m. at the intersection of Main and Neal and Champaign, sponsored by the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. Inshallah, we will be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.